At 16:30 hours on a windless gray afternoon, a lone Ukrainian MiG-29 carved across the sky above Donetsk like a steel arrowhead. The aircraft flew so low that the shockwave of its passage rippled across wheat fields like an invisible hand brushing the land. From the ground, the jet would have appeared and vanished in the same heartbeat, a blur of motion, a fleeting whisper of thunder. But from the cockpit, the pilot saw only the terrain rushing beneath him at a terrifying, exhilarating velocity. He was holding barely 150 meters of altitude, little more than the height of a 50-story building, while slicing through the Dnepro River Valley at 880 kilometers per hour. The walls of the valley rose on either side like the guardrails of a highway no sane pilot would ever choose. Yet for him, it was protection, the only shield between his aircraft and the Russian radar net blanketing the region. He believed he was still unseen. But he was wrong. Even as he threaded through the valley, 3 separate Russian radar systems were already stroking his silhouette with their invisible fingers. To the northeast, an S-400 battery's gravestone radar was tracking him at 38 kilometers. To the south, a Tor M2 was following his heat signature across the valley floor. To the east, a Buk M3 was spooling up, its search radar humming like a predator preparing to pounce. The Russians did not need to coordinate. Their missile coverage overlapped so thickly that any aircraft, Ukrainian, NATO, or extraterrestrial, risked being reduced to molten fragments. In another situation, the pilot might have felt fear, or at least the professional unease that every fighter pilot kept buried beneath layers of training and stubbornness. But he had no space in his mind for such luxuries. Every neuron he possessed was devoted to the impossible task of staying alive long enough to complete his mission. On the small left display of his cockpit, the live reconnaissance feed streamed in from the Ukrainian drone orbiting 11 kilometers above him. It showed the target, the Myrivka Dam, an old Soviet-era structure that the Russians had turned into a makeshift logistics artery. The concrete road spanning its top now served as a superhighway of supply convoys, ammunition trucks, fuelers, troop carriers, all driven by Ukrainian civilians, kidnapped or coerced into labor. That last detail was why this mission could not wait. If he delayed even 30 minutes, civilian drivers would again populate the route. The strike had to occur now, during the single 15-minute window when the crossing would be empty. He checked his instruments. The MiG's SPO-15 radar warning receiver, an old but reliable system, was displaying threat strobes on its circular dial, like the ticks of a furious compass. Each strobe indicated a radar emitter sweeping or focusing on him, but the system could not tell him distance, only direction. It was like hearing someone shouting your name but being unable to tell whether they were across a stadium or standing directly behind you. The pilot counted the intervals between pulses, using the old technique every Eastern Bloc fighter pilot learned: Mississippi timing. If an S-400 sweep pulsed every 3 Mississippis, the radar was probably 60 kilometers away, scanning lazily. If the interval dropped to 2 Mississippis, the radar was actively narrowing its search, interested in something. At 1 Mississippi, the radar was likely within firing parameters and preparing to engage. Right now, he was getting between 2 and 1.5 Mississippis, close enough to sweat, far enough to maneuver. His fuel gauge showed 2,400 kilograms remaining, just enough for 18 minutes of total time over the operational zone. 18 minutes sounded comfortable, but combat was deceptive. A single afterburner climb could burn 100 kilograms in seconds. One extended evasion maneuver could cost him his entire reserve. At low altitude, the RD-33 engines drank fuel like parched animals at a watering hole. Ahead, the valley walls would soon end. In 8 kilometers, they would fall away into open farmland. And beyond that lay the final 8 kilometers to the dam. 8 kilometers with no terrain masking. Pilots called this stretch the shooting gallery. The Russians called it home field advantage. Through the HUD, the ground scrolled beneath him at 236 meters per second. Power lines flickered into view and vanished before conscious thought could register their existence. The pilot flew not with deliberation, but with instinct, muscle memory, and reflex. It was not flying so much as riding the edge of disaster. He glanced at the live drone feed again. No Russian vehicles on the dam, no helicopters inbound, no fighters scrambled. Not yet. He eased the throttles forward. The MiG nudged upward in speed. 880, 885. Every second gained on the ingress was 1 second less spent in the kill zone. At 16:38 hours, the valley opened into rolling farmland, and the world changed. The SPO-15 erupted in sound. What had been intermittent beeps became a continuous, overwhelming cacophony. The aircraft's defensive system screamed at him like a panicked animal. The S-400's gravestone radar snapped from a broad search beam to a narrow tracking beam. At that instant, the pilot became the most interesting object in eastern Ukraine. A solid tone filled his headset. He was locked. Missile launch imminent. He rolled the MiG into a knife-edge turn and pulled 7 Gs, holding altitude. The maneuver forced his velocity vector perpendicular to the S-400 radar beam. To a Doppler radar, he suddenly appeared stationary. His radial velocity dropped to 0, and the radar momentarily interpreted him as terrain. For a brief, precious second, the lock broke. But the maneuver cost him energy and placed him off route, bleeding speed and time. Before he could recover, the Tor M2 lit up from 8 kilometers south. This was worse. The Tor used command-guided missiles, no onboard seeker to jam. The only way to survive was to break the ground radar's tracking. He threw the MiG into a violent dive, dropping from 150 meters to 50 in 2 seconds. Tree branches blurred past his canopy so close he could have counted individual leaves. With his left hand, he pounded the chaff dispensers. Aluminum-coated fibers exploded behind him. First, the long 2.5 centimeter strands to disrupt the S-400's X-band. Then, the 4.3 millimeter strands tuned to the Tor's K-band. It created a shimmering corridor of false radar echoes stretching across the sky. He activated the SPS-141 jamming pod. The pod built a false target, a ghost aircraft, and slowly walked it away from his actual position using range gate pull-off. On Russian radar screens, the decoy appeared brighter and more enticing. The real MiG slipped into ground clutter, but flying at 50 meters was suicide if sustained. Power lines, hills, birds. A moment of misjudgment would mean controlled flight into terrain, the cold, bureaucratic phrase for slamming into the ground while still fully conscious. His release point was approaching, 8 kilometers ahead. He made the decision no flight instructor would ever approve. He would create chaos. If every Russian radar operator was forced to track him simultaneously, their coordination would collapse. At 16:40 hours, the pilot lit the afterburners and pulled straight upward. The RD-33 engines roared like twin dragons. Flames streamed 6 meters behind the aircraft. The MiG leapt skyward with a ferocity that defied reason. Every Russian radar saw him instantly. Inside the S-400 command vehicle, operators watched his altitude climb. 1,000 meters, 2,000, then climbing at 330 meters per second. The computer struggled to predict his trajectory. He added a barrel roll to the ascent, twisting into a corkscrew pattern. The prediction algorithms faltered. No ballistic path, no consistency, only chaos. 3 radars locked him simultaneously. He did not hear distinct tones, only one continuous shriek. At 5,000 meters, inverted, the MiG pointed nose down. The pilot had exactly what he needed, release conditions for the Hammer glide bomb. He steadied the jet for 2 seconds, an eternity under the circumstances. In those 2 seconds, the Hammer ran its entire self-test. GPS verified, INAs aligned, rocket motor armed, IR seeker cooled, trajectory computed, warhead safe and arm passed. He released. The MiG lurched upward from the sudden loss of weight. He rolled inverted and pulled into a 9.5 G dive. Something in the left wing root groaned. He ignored it. The jet dove from 5,000 meters to 500 in 8 seconds, punching through Mach 1.1. Shockwaves rippled across the fuselage. Behind him, 2 S-400 missiles launched, 7.5-meter spears accelerating at 30 G. But they aimed for where he should have been, not where he now plunged. They lost him below tracking angle and detonated harmlessly in the upper atmosphere. The hammer, now free, climbed and then arced downward in its terminal dive. The Buck M3 fired at it, wasting a $1 million missile on a weapon already committed to impact. The pilot skimmed across the terrain at 100 meters, weaving through hills. His fuel was critical. The afterburner climb had consumed 400 kilograms. Behind him, the hammer identified the dam through its infrared seeker. The temperature contrast made the target glow. It adjusted 2 degrees left. Final approach, 300 meters per second, 10 seconds to impact. 8, 5, 3, 2, 1. The hammer struck the dam like a meteor. The warhead detonated, pulverizing concrete, blasting a cavity through the structure. Water pressure did the rest. The breach widened to 60 meters within minutes. The logistics artery the Russians had relied on for months ceased to exist in less than the duration of a television commercial. The pilot did not see the explosion. He was already racing home, fuel dangerously low. The sky behind him glowing faintly where the dam once stood whole. He had survived the valley, the radars, the missiles, the chaos, and the Russians now had a 47-kilometer hole in their supply routes. For today, at least, that was enough.